The last of today's live tech talks. I am a senior system engineer at Round Tower Technologies. Kind of joke, I've got a lot of content, 167 slides. I'm going to try and skip through it real quick, so just kidding. All right, so a little bit about me. I am a vExpert and VCP certified. Also currently one of the co-leaders for the Indianapolis VTUG. You can find me on Twitter at V2Mike. Or follow my blog, virtualcloffice.com. I plan on putting this presentation up later for everybody to download. All right, so my presentation is over SRM Lessons Learned. I've installed this and implemented it and used it several times with customers of Round Tower, as well as on the managed services side. I've actually done some execution of the the big red button per se. So before we get started, I kind of want to talk about two different key aspects of SRM that you kind of want to take into consideration before you do any design, install, or implementation, right? So the first one is SAN-based replication and or vSphere replication. So there's a possibility where you can use both depending on your environment. So make sure you have that kind of on your mindset when you're starting to plan your SRM implementation. The other thing to keep in mind is whether you're going to do a single or bidirectional failover, right? So in some scenarios you may have an active-active site, and in some scenarios you may have an active-passive site where you don't use your DR site except as a DR site. So moving on to the install, I may not go over all the slides or all the bullet points, but they're there for your reference. The first thing that I like to keep in mind is during the installation, there's a couple things that you're going to want to kind of plan for or do during that time. So the first one that I like to talk about is SSL certificates. If you plan on ever doing like a domain sign or self-sign, depending on your corporate policy, just make sure you keep that in mind. The installation is really the only time to do that. The database location, right? So there's a couple different gotchas on that. One that I've come across is during an SRM implementation that I've done in the past, the database was actually mixed in with other production systems. So what I like to do is I like to call this a site-specific database location, right? So I'll kind of get into it a little bit more, but during the installation there's also very specific permissions and schema settings that you'll want to have set up on your database server, and just make sure to read the documentation for that. The other thing you may want to keep in mind is link mode. If you're going to use it, I would definitely make sure that you kind of have it set up beforehand or whatnot. Service accounts, right? So if you have a service account, I would maybe set up a separate one for that, but also make sure that that service account can authenticate at either site. Typically you'd want to use the same one, but you can kind of separate that from the rest of your environment. The last thing you want is a bunch of servers trying to power on and lock out that service account. So the other thing is what setting you use for your connection between the sites in terms of the IP or DNS when you set up that initial connection. If you're doing storage or, SAN or array-based replication, a lot of companies such as NetApp, they have a virtual storage console. EMC has a VSI, and other, check with your storage vendor, but they will have kind of a storage array plugin that they have in vCenter, but you may also want to have that because there's sometimes ties into that when you install the SRA. The SRA is the storage replication adapter. It's specific to each storage vendor, right? A lot of my experiences with NetApp and again EMC, the one that I typically use for customers, the latest one for NetApp is 2.01 P2. Some of them I've run into situations where the one that's posted on the site, on the VMware website, is not the one that actually works. Depending on your environment, there are some known bugs. And also make sure that you keep in mind that vSphere replication can be installed on the SRM server, the capability of vSphere replication, but you don't actually have to deploy vSphere replication until after the fact. All right. The next thing is once you have your vCenter server, your SRM server installed and a connection created between the sites, the next thing you're going to want to do is mapping, right? again, you're going to want to refer to your single or bidirectional design plan. But the first thing that I'm going to talk about is networks, right? So when you map your networks, you're going to map your production network at your protected site to the production network at your recovery site. Now, it may be within the same subnet or VLAN, or it may be its own separate VLAN, but just make sure that you keep in mind that you're going to do only the production version of it. So I'm going to get into the different isolated test VLANs that you may want to use. The other thing that I like to do is keep a separate naming scheme or a pattern for the naming convention, right? So in some situations you can use like a 10.1.1 for your primary site and a 10.1.2 for any protected or recovery VMs. The other thing that I like to talk about is your folders. So when you're mapping your folders, you don't, if you're doing a bidirectional mapping, you don't want to map a folder to the same folder that you just replicated one direction. There could be some conflict there. What I like to do is create a recovery folder on my recovery site and have all my production folders underneath that. Resource pools. So again, you can kind of play around with this. Especially in a resource-constrained environment, resource pools are kind of critical to this. In some situations, you can just create a resource pool, set the shares value to 0. As long as you're not testing or using SRM, that's fine. One thing that I like to do is actually put in a script that will allow you to modify the resource pool shares. So like, let's say during a test failover, I only allow 50% resources. So I'll set the shares value to a certain value during a test. But then during an actual failover, I may set the shares value to 75 or 90% of the actual resource available in that cluster. That kind of allows you to maybe keep some services powered on, but then again, adjust as needed, right? The next thing I'm going to talk about is the data stores during SRM. So this is a lot of storage-specific concepts, right? So again, refer to whether it's single or bidirectional. And whether you're using array-based or array-based or vSphere replication. So when you're separating the data stores, or when you're kind of designing which data stores are going to be protected, on SAN-based replication, it is per data store, right? So if you're using vSphere replication, it's not so much as a problem. But what I like to do is separate test, dev, and QA from your production environment, right? That's the first step. The second thing you want to keep in mind is separating your protected production VMs from your non-protected production VMs. For example, VMs that are production VMs but you don't want to protect are the SRM server itself, the vCenter server, if you separate your VMware Update Manager server, vShield is another example, as well as the database, right? So you don't want to actually protect the database server that SRM is on, because that situation is not actually going to work. Trust me, I've tried that. So the other thing I do like to break out is the swap file data store. The swap file data store is good to break out, especially if you're still using older versions of SRM. It doesn't actually delete the virtual swap file, so it's kind of replicating all that data that it's just going to power it on and delete it. But if you separate that out, it does cut down on your recovery time. Another consideration is whether you're using NFS or VMFS data stores, right? So if you're using basically IP or fiber channel data stores, you want to make sure that you realize that the storage at one site, especially if you're using like a unified storage device, you may have fiber channel at your production, but only IP at your DR site. That IP storage might not be able to map unless you use like iSCSI or something like that. So just keep in mind that with array-based replication, going from a VMFS to an NFS or vice versa may not map out. You won't be able to map those LUNs to those hosts. That also kind of ties into the next line, which is RDMs, right? So if you have RDMs connected to those VMs, you'll have to map them the same way you map your storage. Next thing is the recovery plans, right? So once you have your network mappings configured and your data stores and protection groups created, the recovery plan. So I like to start out with configuring some of the VMs. What I like to do is there's a command line that allows you to create an IP scheme for all your current IP addresses, all your test IP addresses, and your production failover IP addresses. So there's kind of 3 different IP addresses you can set there. Sorry, 2. So, right, so, sorry, you have your original protection IP address and your protected site, I'm sorry, your recovery site IP address. So if you do it through the command line, you can import it and export it, plus it also gives you that IP address table that you can use. There's some scripts and prompts that you can run with. What I always like to do with prompts is start with a prompt and then put a script in later. I'm going to kind of go into the different types of recovery plans I create. The first one is kind of like a default auto-isolated VM recovery plan. That's just no specific settings, but allows you to verify whether the VM has been recovered in a consistent state. A private isolated is where you have the VMs in an isolated network, one that's not routed or not touching your production. And then you actually have your production recovery plan, which makes all the permanent changes to your VMs as you recover them. You also want to make sure that NTP, DNS, and AD authentication, you want to make sure that you've got your time zone set up right and you're all using the same NTP server. As long as you have a time zone set properly and you're using the right UTC time, then everything should work correctly. But you just want to keep that in consideration. Also, I like to throw in a Windows XP or Windows 7 desktop into a recovery plan. That way, in an isolated environment, you can actually pull up an application within the vSphere console without kind of touching the, creating some rule to export from the outside or using a server to verify that SharePoint's up. All right, so execution, right? And I'm going to kind of run through some of this, but make sure you know that in an auto-isolated recovery plan, you're just verifying the consistency level, okay? So you're just making sure that the VM can power on. In a private isolated, you have kind of a private VLAN that's not really touching production, but you may want to pull in some scripts or, you're kind of verifying whether scripts or inter-VM communication is actually working, right? DNS is failing over, etc. Sometimes people use DNS, or you can use LM host file during this, but that's a good time to put it in there. For production, you want to make sure that you actually want to run a production failover. So a lot of times people only test, but they never do an actual failover. The process of doing a failover is a lot different than a test. So you want to make sure that the storage has permission to reverse replication, etc. And I always say that you want to actually run a full test or some sort of a test in order to verify that SRM is functioning properly. All right. Another tip, always, always, always do a discover devices on your SRA before you run any production. That makes sure that all the volumes are replicating properly and the VMs are protected. And then the other thing is understand the SRA, right? So each storage appliance or each SRA from each vendor has a different set of scripts that run in the background. Make sure you understand at which level what scripts are running, when snap mirror or your snap replication is swapping back and forth between the sites. And then lastly, on my last slide is the big red button. So what happens if you actually have to run an SRM test? In my example, we actually had a customer that had to run SRM because Hurricane Sandy came in and shut off the power to their data center. So the first thing I like to say is don't panic, right? Make sure you have a complete data center power on, power off procedure. Because one thing that we learned from that is that we didn't actually know how to power on our environment without SRM coming into play or VMs powering on automatically. So make sure you kind of keep that into consideration. Have a backup plan. Make sure that if SRM does not work, that you have a way to recover your VMs. Your storage is replicated, you should come up with kind of in your mind what would happen, or better yet, put in some scripts that you know that will run without SRM. If you see it coming, test it. So one of the mistakes we made is we saw Hurricane Sandy coming, but we didn't verify that SRM was actually error-free, that a test would work and all that. If during an actual SRM failover, you may be running kind of like a 24/7 recovery plan, right? One thing that we did is we had a lot of resources on call for the first 24 hours, and I actually had probably sleep deprivation by the end of it, and we had resources that we could have had on standby. We also learned that you need to have an alternate form of communication so that you can post updates. So whether it's a WebEx or a Google account or some sort of email or chat, make sure that you have that kind of running outside of your DR scenario. And then one of the other big things that kind of set us back when we did this failover was we didn't have a backdoor remote access to our secondary data center. It actually ran through the primary data center, which did not have power. So those are just a few things that I've come across, and I'd like to thank you for joining me for this Tech Talk Brown Bag.